It was a warm afternoon in the heart of a bustling urban neighborhood. The streets were alive with the sounds of honking cars, children laughing, and vendors calling out to passers-by. Sidewalks were crowded with people going about their day, shoppers browsing through stalls, office workers rushing back from lunch, and friends catching up over coffee. The vibrancy of the neighborhood was a testament to its rich, diverse culture, a place where everyone seemed to know each other. Amid this lively scene, Marcus Carter walked down the street, his hands in his pockets and a small smile on his face. Marcus was a familiar figure in the community, a kind-hearted man who volunteered at the local youth center and was always ready to lend a helping hand. That afternoon, he had just left the corner store, where he'd helped the elderly owner carry heavy boxes to the back room. His day was unremarkable, ordinary and calm, until it wasn't. Suddenly, a police cruiser pulled up sharply to the curb, and an officer stepped out. Officer James Miller, a stern-faced man with a commanding presence, scanned the street before locking his gaze on Marcus. The officer's demeanor was tense and impatient, his voice cutting through the hum of the busy street. "You there! Stop!" he barked, striding toward Marcus with an air of authority. Startled, Marcus turned around, confused but compliant. "What's this about, officer?" Marcus asked calmly, his tone steady. "You match the description of a suspect in a theft reported nearby," Officer Miller said, his eyes narrowing. The accusation hung in the air, heavy with assumption. Marcus began to explain his whereabouts, but it was clear that the officer wasn't in the mood to listen. The moment marked the beginning of a confrontation that would soon grip the entire community. Marcus stood still, his hands visible at his sides, his calm demeanor unwavering despite the tension thickening in the air. "Officer, I've been at the corner store helping Mr. Harris unload some boxes. You can ask him. He'll vouch for me," Marcus said, his voice even and respectful. But Officer Miller didn't seem interested in Marcus's explanation. He stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster, his voice rising. "I said you match the description. Don't argue with me," he snapped. A few passers-by slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued by the sharp tone of the officer's voice. Marcus raised his hands slightly, palms open in a gesture of non-aggression. "I'm not arguing, sir. I'm just telling you where I've been. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's irritation seemed to flare at Marcus's calmness. "Are you resisting?" Miller demanded, his stance becoming more aggressive. The question carried an edge of accusation that sent a ripple of unease through the small but growing crowd of onlookers. A couple of them had already pulled out their phones, recording the exchange, sensing that this was a moment that demanded witness. "No, sir, I'm not resisting," Marcus replied, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. He knew his rights, and he knew he was innocent. But he also knew how these situations often unfolded. The officer ignored his words, stepping closer still. The tension broke like a dam. Without warning, Miller grabbed Marcus by the arm, twisting it behind his back. Marcus winced but didn't resist, his body stiffening as he tried to stay composed. "Hey, man! He didn't do anything!" someone from the crowd shouted. "Leave him alone!" another voice chimed in. Miller didn't seem to hear them, or didn't care. In a sudden, shocking motion, he shoved Marcus to the ground with such force that the sound of his body hitting the pavement echoed through the street. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the onlookers. A young woman standing nearby covered her mouth in horror, her phone trembling in her hands as she continued to record. "Stop! You're hurting him!" A middle-aged man in the crowd stepped forward, his voice firm but pleading. He wore a reflective construction vest, clearly on his way home from work. "You can't do this! It's not right!" Miller shot the man a glare, his hand moving to his radio. "Step back, or you're next!" he barked, his voice brimming with hostility. The man hesitated, but didn't retreat entirely, his hands raised in a defensive posture. Marcus, now on the ground, could feel the rough pavement scraping his skin. He tried to keep his voice calm, though pain and humiliation threatened to break through. "I'm not resisting, officer. Please, you don't need to do this." But Miller wasn't listening. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs, snapping them onto Marcus's wrists with a force that made him flinch. The crowd grew louder, their protests building like a wave. A young man in a hoodie called out, "We're all watching this. You can't get away with it." Miller lifted his radio to his mouth. "I need backup at 5th and Main. Situation escalating," he said, his tone clipped and devoid of context. The crowd's anger swelled, but there was also an undercurrent of fear. Some people worried about intervening further, knowing the risks of escalating the situation. Still, their phones stayed trained on the scene, capturing every second. Marcus was pulled roughly to his feet, his wrists bound behind him. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed a deep sadness, a mix of humiliation and resignation. He looked at the crowd, seeing their outrage, their solidarity, and their helplessness. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said softly to the officer, his voice almost drowned out by the crowd. "You're under arrest," Miller growled. "We'll sort it out at the station." "No, you're making the mistake," shouted the construction worker again, stepping closer despite Miller's threatening posture. "This man hasn't done anything wrong, and we've all got it on video." The woman with the phone chimed in. "I'm live streaming this. The world is watching." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd, emboldening them. More voices joined in, some shouting Marcus's innocence, others condemning the officer's actions. Miller hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the phones aimed at him, but his grip on Marcus didn't loosen. The tension was electric, the street buzzing with the weight of collective outrage. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the air. 2 additional police cars pulled up, and more officers stepped out, scanning the scene with wary eyes. The crowd instinctively took a step back but didn't disperse. Their presence was a silent protest, a collective refusal to let the incident go unnoticed. The additional officers moved toward Miller, exchanging hushed words. One of them, an older officer with a calmer demeanor, approached Marcus. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone neutral but cautious. Before Marcus could answer, voices from the crowd erupted again, recounting the story from their perspective, their words overlapping in a chaotic symphony of indignation. The older officer frowned, clearly aware that this was no ordinary arrest. Meanwhile, Miller stood stiffly, his face a mask of defiance, but with a flicker of unease. The crowd's chants and the ever-present phones recording his every move were undeniable reminders that this moment wouldn't disappear into silence. As Marcus stood between the officers, his fate hanging in the balance, the crowd's voice grew louder, a chorus demanding justice, truth, and accountability. What had started as a small altercation on a busy street was quickly becoming a flashpoint that would reach far beyond that neighborhood. It didn't take long for the events on 5th and Main to escape the confines of the bustling urban street. By the time Marcus was escorted to the police station in handcuffs, his face etched with pain and disbelief, the first video of the incident was already making waves online. A young woman, whose live stream had captured every moment, uploaded the footage to social media with a caption that read, "This is what injustice looks like. Just justice for Marcus." The video, raw and unfiltered, showed Officer Miller slamming Marcus to the ground, indifferent to the cries of bystanders. It captured Marcus's calm demeanor, his repeated assertions of innocence, and the officer's escalating aggression. Within minutes, the post began to spread like wildfire. In the first hour alone, the video had been viewed over 100,000 times. Comments flooded in, ranging from expressions of outrage to personal stories of similar encounters. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus and #Stop Police Brutality trended across platforms, amplifying the conversation. Influencers and activists with large followings reposted the video, urging their audiences to take notice. By the end of the day, the video had reached mainstream media. News outlets began running headlines such as, Caught on camera, police brutality sparks, outrage in urban neighborhood, and viral video raises questions about use of force. The footage became the center of national attention, forcing viewers to confront the harsh realities of systemic bias and abuse of power. As the video circulated, the outcry grew louder. Online petitions demanding justice for Marcus garnered tens of thousands of signatures within hours. People from all walks of life voiced their solidarity, calling for accountability and change. By the second day, the outrage that had simmered online boiled over into real-life action. Protests began to form in Marcus's neighborhood, with crowds gathering in front of the local police precinct. Signs with slogans like "Justice for Marcus," "Hold officers accountable," and "No more abuse of power" filled the air as chants echoed through the streets. Community leaders and activists spoke passionately about the need for systemic reform. Local pastors, educators, and business owners stood shoulder to shoulder with Marcus's family and friends. Marcus's mother, a soft-spoken woman with tear-filled eyes, addressed the crowd, her voice quivering with both sorrow and strength. "My son has done nothing but serve this community," she said, "and yet he was treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin." The protests remained peaceful, but their message was clear. The community would not rest until justice was served. News cameras captured the crowds, broadcasting the protests nationwide, further fueling the movement. Meanwhile, the viral video had reached Officer Miller's superiors, creating shockwaves within the department. The footage left no room for interpretation. It was a blatant display of excessive force and abuse of power. The department, already under scrutiny for past incidents of misconduct, knew that ignoring this would only deepen the public's anger. An internal investigation was launched immediately. Officer Miller was placed on administrative leave, while the department's public relations team scrambled to control the narrative. In a brief press release, the police chief expressed concern over the incident and promised a thorough review. But the statement did little to quell the outrage. As the investigation progressed, disturbing details about Officer Miller's past began to emerge. Internal reports revealed a history of complaints against him, excessive force, verbal abuse, and racial profiling. Although none of these had previously resulted in disciplinary action, the weight of his record now loomed large. Activists demanded to know why Miller had been allowed to continue serving, questioning the department's accountability. Community leaders wasted no time amplifying their demands. Civil rights organizations held press conferences, calling for Officer Miller's termination and an overhaul of police policies. Local politicians joined the conversation, some attending protests and pledging to introduce legislation aimed at police reform. Social media continued to play a crucial role in the movement. The hashtag #FireOfficerMiller gained traction, with users tagging the police department, city officials, and national leaders. Videos of the protests and personal testimonials about Marcus flooded timelines, ensuring that the story remained at the forefront of public discourse. National figures, including prominent activists and celebrities, began to weigh in. Donations poured into a legal defense fund for Marcus, and organizations dedicated to fighting police brutality saw a surge in support. The momentum was undeniable, and the pressure on the police department intensified with every passing hour. Under mounting pressure, the police chief held a press conference 3 days after the incident. Flanked by senior officers, he addressed the public with a somber tone. "We have reviewed the footage of the incident involving Officer James Miller and Marcus Carter," he began. "What we saw was deeply troubling. This does not reflect the values of our department or the community we serve." The announcement that Officer Miller had been suspended without pay, pending the outcome of the investigation, was met with mixed reactions. For many, it wasn't enough. "Suspension isn't justice," one protester told a news crew. "Firing him is just the start. What we need is real accountability and reform." As the department scrambled to salvage its reputation, the movement continued to grow. Protests expanded to neighboring cities, and grassroots organizations began holding town halls to discuss broader issues of systemic racism and police misconduct. Marcus's story had become a symbol, a rallying cry for change. For Marcus, the turning point wasn't just about his own experience. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence. In a statement released through his lawyer, Marcus said, "I am overwhelmed by the support from my community and beyond. This fight isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." The video had done more than expose one officer's misconduct. It had ignited a movement. What had started as a routine walk down the street had become a moment that challenged the status quo, forcing a nation to confront uncomfortable truths and demanding a future where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. As the protests gained momentum and the video continued to dominate headlines, the focus shifted to the individuals at the center of the incident. Marcus Carter, the man slammed to the ground and wrongfully arrested, became the face of a broader struggle for justice. For many, his story wasn't just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of systemic inequality that demanded accountability. The community quickly rallied around Marcus, sharing stories that painted a vivid picture of his character. Neighbors, co-workers, and friends stepped forward to speak about the man they knew. A devoted volunteer at the local youth center, a mentor to at-risk kids, and a dedicated advocate for positive change in the neighborhood. "He's the kind of guy who would give you his last dollar if you needed it," one neighbor said during a televised interview. "Marcus has been a pillar of this community for years. Seeing him treated like this is heartbreaking." Videos and photos of Marcus working with children at the youth center surfaced, adding a humanizing depth to his story. In one image, he was helping a young boy fix a bicycle. In another, he was leading a group of kids on a cleanup project at a nearby park. These images, coupled with heartfelt testimonials, reinforced his role as a selfless and kind-hearted individual who had always put his community first. Local business owners and faith leaders joined the chorus of support. The pastor of Marcus's church described him as a man of unwavering faith and compassion, while the owner of the corner store where the incident began publicly vouched for Marcus's innocence. "He was helping me with my deliveries that day," the store owner said. "That man didn't have a dishonest bone in his body." As Marcus's reputation was solidified in the eyes of the public, investigators turned their attention to Officer James Miller. Under intense scrutiny, the department began reviewing his record, and what they found was deeply concerning. Internal reports revealed a pattern of complaints against Miller, stretching back years. There were multiple allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional conduct. While none of these complaints had previously led to significant disciplinary action, they painted a picture of an officer with a history of crossing the line. One case involved a young man who accused Miller of using unnecessary force during a routine traffic stop. Another complaint came from a woman who said Miller had harassed her during a domestic dispute call. Although these incidents had been quietly dismissed or downplayed at the time, they now took on a new significance. Activists and community leaders seized on this information, questioning why Miller had been allowed to remain on the force despite his history. "This isn't just about one bad day or one bad officer," said a local civil rights attorney. "This is about a system that protects those who abuse their power." The combination of Marcus's spotless reputation and Miller's troubled history only amplified calls for justice. As public pressure mounted, the investigation took on a new urgency, with officials promising transparency and swift action. The revelations not only cast Miller in an even harsher light, but also highlighted systemic flaws within the police department, sparking a broader conversation about accountability and reform. The pressure on the police department reached a boiling point within days of the incident. As protests continued to swell and social media amplified calls for justice, the department was forced to act decisively. Public trust was on the line, and inaction was no longer an option. On the fifth day after the incident, the police department held a press conference. The chief of police, visibly weary from the public outcry, stood before a room packed with reporters and community leaders. Flanked by senior officers, he addressed the gathered crowd with a somber expression. After a thorough review of the events that transpired on 5th and Main, and based on the evidence presented, we have made the decision to terminate Officer James Miller, effective immediately, he announced. Gasps of relief and murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. The chief continued, "The actions of Officer Miller do not reflect the values of this department or the standards we strive to uphold. We deeply regret the pain and suffering caused to Mr. Marcus Carter and his family. On behalf of the department, I offer a formal and sincere apology." The words carried weight, but they were only the beginning of the resolution the community demanded. Reporters pressed for details about reforms, while activists demanded to know why it had taken so long for such a decision to be made. Still, for many, the termination of Officer Miller marked a critical step toward justice. Simultaneously, Marcus Carter was released from custody, his name cleared of any wrongdoing. The charges initially filed against him were dropped, and the department issued a formal statement exonerating him. Marcus, dressed simply in jeans and a hoodie, emerged from the precinct to the cheers of supporters gathered outside. "I'm grateful to everyone who stood by me," Marcus said in a brief but emotional statement to the press. "This fight isn't just about me. It's about all the people who have been silenced, mistreated, and ignored. Together, we're making sure this doesn't happen again." His words struck a chord, echoing the sentiments of a movement that had grown far beyond his personal ordeal. As he walked away from the station, surrounded by his family and community members, he held his head high, a symbol of resilience and hope. The termination of Officer Miller and Marcus's release were victories, but the community knew the fight for justice was far from over. Using the momentum of the incident, local leaders organized a series of events to honor Marcus and push for systemic change. The first was a candlelight vigil held at the park where Marcus volunteered. Hundreds of people gathered, holding candles and signs, listening to speakers recount Marcus's contributions to the community and the broader need for reform. The vigil was followed by a town hall meeting where activists, city officials, and law enforcement representatives engaged in a frank discussion about accountability. Marcus, still processing the whirlwind of events, spoke candidly about his experience. "It's not enough to fire one officer," he said. "We need to make sure no one else goes through this." The message resonated. City officials committed to implementing policy changes, starting with mandatory body cameras for all officers and enhanced de-escalation training. A citizen oversight board was proposed, aimed at increasing transparency and ensuring independent investigations into police misconduct. The changes didn't stop at the local level. Marcus's story, amplified by the viral video and ongoing media coverage, became a national talking point. Advocacy groups cited his experience in campaigns pushing for broader reforms, from increased police accountability to addressing systemic racism within law enforcement. Celebrities and public figures lent their voices to the cause, donating to organizations fighting for justice and sharing Marcus's story with their audiences. Meanwhile, grassroots movements used the incident as a rallying cry, organizing marches and workshops focused on educating communities about their rights. Marcus, once a quiet mentor at a neighborhood youth center, found himself thrust into the spotlight. While the attention was overwhelming at times, he embraced his new role as an advocate. He continued working with kids, using his story to teach them about resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. The community's support for Marcus didn't waver. Local businesses raised funds to help him rebuild after the emotional and financial toll of the ordeal. The youth center where he volunteered renamed its mentorship program after him, a lasting tribute to his strength and dedication. Months later, the neighborhood held a block party celebrating the changes that had been made. Music filled the air, children played in the streets, and neighbors shared food and laughter. In the center of it all stood Marcus, surrounded by the people who had rallied around him. The event wasn't just a celebration of one man's resilience. It was a testament to the power of community and the potential for change. A mural was unveiled on a nearby wall, depicting Marcus standing tall, surrounded by children and symbols of hope. Above it, bold letters read, "Justice, Unity, Change." The incident on 5th and Main had started as a moment of injustice, but ended as a catalyst for progress. Marcus's story became a symbol of what could be achieved when a community united against wrongdoing. While the scars of that day would never fully fade, they served as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of collective action. As Marcus stood before the mural, watching the neighborhood celebrate, he knew that his fight had not been in vain. His voice, amplified by the voices of thousands, had sparked a movement that would ripple far beyond the streets where it all began. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to smile, genuine, unburdened, and full of hope. Sitting under the soft glow of stage lights in a community center packed with supporters, Marcus Carter shared his story in an emotional and candid interview that would be broadcast nationwide. The room was silent, hanging on his every word as he recounted the events that had changed his life and the lives of so many others. "It's still hard to believe that what happened on that street that day could turn into something this big," Marcus began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I was just going about my day, trying to help someone out like I always do. Never in a million years did I think I'd end up in handcuffs, let alone at the center of a movement." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, filled with friends, family, and neighbors who had stood by him. "What happened to me wasn't just about one bad officer or one bad decision. It was about a system that's been broken for a long time, and while I wouldn't wish what I went through on anyone, I'm grateful for what came out of it: awareness, unity, and hope." Marcus's voice cracked slightly as he spoke about the support he'd received. "I can't thank this community enough. You all stood by me when I felt most alone. You raised your voices when I couldn't. You didn't just fight for me. You fought for what's right. That means more to me than words can ever express." As he reflected on his journey, Marcus turned his attention to the future. "This isn't the end," he said firmly. "It's just the beginning. There's so much work to be done, so many voices that still need to be heard, so many lives that need protecting. I'm going to keep fighting, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt powerless, ignored, or unseen." The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Marcus wiped a tear from his cheek, humbled yet emboldened by the overwhelming support. The incident on 5th and Main had sparked not just a local movement, but a legacy of tangible change. The city had implemented mandatory body cameras for all officers, ensuring that future incidents would have an undeniable record. De-escalation training became a core requirement for the police force, and a civilian oversight board was established to review misconduct cases. For Marcus, though, the most meaningful change was the renewed sense of community. The bonds formed in the aftermath of his ordeal had strengthened the neighborhood in ways he couldn't have imagined. One sunny afternoon, the community gathered once again, this time to celebrate the unveiling of a plaque at the corner of 5th and Main. The plaque bore Marcus's name and a simple inscription: "In honor of resilience, unity, and the power of standing together for justice." The ceremony was bittersweet. As Marcus stood by the plaque, surrounded by neighbors and supporters, he felt a mix of pride and sorrow. He hadn't chosen to be the face of this movement, but he was determined to honor it by continuing to make a difference. "Today isn't about me," Marcus said during his brief speech. "It's about us, about what we can achieve when we stand together. This plaque is a reminder of the work we've done and the work still ahead of us. It's a symbol of hope, and I hope it inspires everyone who walks by to fight for what's right." True to his word, Marcus returned to his roots, dedicating himself to mentoring at-risk youth at the local community center. He used his story to teach lessons of resilience, self-worth, and the importance of standing up for justice. "Mr. Marcus taught me that my voice matters," said Jamal, a 14-year-old boy who looked up to Marcus as a role model. "He said even if people try to silence you, you should keep speaking your truth." The youth center flourished under Marcus's guidance, gaining new resources and attention thanks to the spotlight his story had brought. Donations poured in, allowing for expanded programs, from academic tutoring to sports leagues. Marcus's vision of a safe space where kids could learn, grow, and feel empowered had finally become a reality. The ripple effect of Marcus's story reached far beyond his neighborhood. His courage inspired similar movements in other cities, where communities rallied for justice and police reform. Civil rights organizations invited Marcus to speak at events and conferences, where his words resonated with audiences hungry for change. But for Marcus, the most rewarding moments were the quiet ones. Teaching a young boy to tie a tie, listening to a teenager talk about their dreams, or simply sharing a laugh with the kids who had become his second family. One evening, Marcus stood outside the community center, watching the kids play basketball under the streetlights. The sound of their laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the chaos and pain he'd endured months earlier. He smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. As the sun set on the neighborhood that day, Marcus walked home, passing the mural painted in his honor. It depicted him standing tall, surrounded by symbols of unity and hope. Above it, bold letters spelled out the words, "Justice, Unity, Change." Marcus paused, taking a moment to reflect on how far they had come. His journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative, not just for him, but for his entire community. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt a deep sense of purpose. With renewed determination, Marcus continued walking, his steps confident and steady. He was no longer just a victim of injustice. He was a catalyst for change, a beacon of hope, and a testament to the power of resilience and unity. And for that he was grateful. He